The new iMac is here, and it's great. People love this thing. It is thin, it's beautiful. This one's purple, it's great. But I've heard a lot of people saying that it's a little bit expensive. You have to pay extra for, the full-fat M1 chip, and there's been some complaining from people who just kind of wished that it was a little bit more pro. And I'm not talking about the type of people that every time a Mac comes out say, oh, that should have a RTX 3090 in it and be $600. Not that group of people, but there were a number of people, myself included, who had hoped that this upgrade would also feature more powerful Apple Silicon chips, even if optional, even if on the higher end. The M1 chip has been used quite a lot, and it's a really great device, but when you're spending $2,000 for a well-spec'd one of these, it does make you wonder, can you do any better? And today, that's what we're gonna find out. So you may be wondering what exactly is going on. Well, if you couldn't tell, the wedge-shaped box kind of gives it away. This is an iMac, specifically the old iMac. Everyone else out there reviewing the new iMac, I got the old one. Specifically, this is the 2020 refresh, kind of. It's the 2019 model, but this is the one that has SSD as standard instead of the Fusion drive, thankfully. So this is also a base model. This was the $1,300 model. It has a quad-core i3, 8 gigs of RAM, 256 gigabytes of storage, as well as the Radeon Pro 555X. Now I know what you're thinking. Luke, why are you out here buying this old, much worse iMac when the new shiny ones are already here? Well, there's two reasons. Number one, I paid $750 for this thing, which is significantly less than a base model M1 iMac. And the other big reason has more to do with what's missing than what's present. See, the current iMac is a beautiful device. No one is disputing that. Actually, no, a lot of people are disputing that. The new iMacs are, shall we say, distinctive, but they have absolutely no upgradability whatsoever. You get what you get, and you don't get upset. And by get upset, I mean fix anything, because it's stuck with whatever you order it with. The same is not true of the old generation iMac. This may be a lowly base model with just 8 gigabytes of RAM and a paltry Core i3, but that's not how it's going to stay, because I've bought this, 32 gigabytes of RAM, and most importantly, this, a Core i9 9900. That's right. This quad-core i3 iMac is gonna have its cores doubled from 4 to 8 with the help of this Core i9. Now, I know what you're probably thinking is, wait, hang on, is that even possible? This is a Core i3 8100 and this is a Core i9 9900. But what's important there is that I didn't say K. This is not a 9900K. See, the way that these iMacs work is their CPUs are mainly limited by the power supply. So in this case, it's a 65-watt socket. Now, this particular iMac and this specific logic board could handle up to the Core i7 8700, which you could order from Apple directly, but because it's the same chipset and the same logic board and the same power supply, you can actually put a Core i9 9900 in this machine. So the goal of this video is twofold. Number one, if you already have a base model iMac, could you upgrade it for significantly less than replacing it? And number two, if you're thinking about buying an iMac, would it make more sense to buy an old one and supercharge it with a Core i9, or should you just go right ahead and buy the new M1 model? Well, to complicate things a little bit, I paid $750 for this iMac, I paid $350 for this Core i9, and I paid about $150 for 32 gigabytes of RAM, which means that this iMac, if everything goes according to plan, should end up costing $1,250, $50 less than the base model M1 iMac. So is it gonna be more powerful for less money? Is it gonna be less powerful for less money? Or is it gonna be about the same for about the same? Let's find out. So in theory at least, this upgrade should be relatively simple. We don't need that many parts. There's the Core i9 and the 32 gigabytes of RAM that we're going to be installing, and then we just need some iFixit display adhesive strips because of course the display is glued on and we're going to have to cut it off, and we'll need these to put it all back together again. So for today's video, we're going to be following the iFixit repair guides, which are very comprehensive and show you how to take apart this iMac, replace the RAM, replace the CPU. Basically, all you have to do is figure out how to take out the logic board, and that's what iFixit's guide can help you with. So the links to parts and tools and guides are in the description below. So without any further ado, let's hop into it, and we'll start by cutting off the display. This can take a little bit of time. It's really strong adhesive and it'll take a couple of minutes to get it off cleanly. So for best results, I used a combination of the picks that come in the iFixit Protect toolkit as well as the iMac opening wheel that comes with the display adhesive strips. Once inside, it's a very familiar look. If you've seen the inside of one previous gen iMac, you've seen them all. The thing that's really amusing on this particular model, because this was the 2020 update that just removed the hard drive, is there are still brackets for a hard drive that no longer exists anymore. You can see where the hard drive would go, but isn't. And so Apple just keeps putting the brackets in. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and start by taking off this little strap at the chin of the iMac. The chin strap, if you will. This is just held in with a couple of Phillips head screws, but once it's removed, it reveals the scary part about working on any of these iMacs, and that is the exposed power supply. Say what you will about the new iMac with its external power brick, but it means that you don't have to deal with this when you open it up. And then comes a very careful dance of removing the connectors and taking out the power supply without touching the exposed traces on the front, which have a risk of electric shock. This process is nerve-wracking and lengthy. It took me a long time to get the connector that connects the power supply to the actual socket on the back out. Fortunately now, with the big bad scary power supply out of the way, things get a lot more relaxed. We'll spend a couple of minutes disconnecting all of the various connectors and unscrewing the logic board from the housing. Now, do be warned, it does take a fair amount of wiggling to get this logic board out of the enclosure because the ports and the chin are very tight tolerance and it takes a little bit of time. But once we have the board out, you can basically have access to all of the components apart from the GPU that make this iMac tick. Unlike the 27-inch iMac, this older one still has a user upgradable SSD. So just like the older Retina MacBook Pros, you can upgrade this as much as you want. They also left the SATA port. So even though the hard drive is now gone, you can buy a connector and use the existing hard drive bracket to add an additional internal hard drive if you wanted to do that. But today we're focusing on the RAM and the CPU, so we'll remove this fun perforated housing that holds the 2 SODIMM slots this machine can accept, and we'll replace it with 32 gigabytes of RAM up from 8. And I'll tell you one thing, it costs a heck of a lot less than paying Apple for it. Now, the next step is going to be removing the heatsink, which covers both the CPU and GPU. So on the back of the board, there's this bracket that holds the CPU in place, and it's a bit of a tough cookie to crack. It's very tensioned, and you really got to get some elbow grease to get this thing out. But flipping the board over, there's a couple of T8 screws that hold the heatsink and then have the bracket for the GPU. These are a lot easier to unscrew, and with that, the whole assembly just pops right off. But do keep in mind, the CPU is actually stored in the heatsink. It'll be held in by the thermal paste, so you'll want to scrape that off, as well as cleaning off the GPU. And we are now at the midpoint of our repair. Everything is as disassembled as it needs to be, and it's time for the fun stuff. It's Core i9 time, people. Let's get this thing in the board, put on the thermal paste, and we can start reassembling this iMac. It's all fun and games, but now we're getting to the point where, I gotta put back that scary power supply. Look, I know you don't want to do it, but you gotta do it, so just get it done, get it over with. Alright, there you go. Alright, let's get this thing in here and get this whole thing wrapped up. Now here's where you gotta be careful, folks. If you put the screen back on before you test everything and you forget to plug something in, you have to cut it back off and buy new adhesive strips. So make sure that you test everything before applying the adhesive. But with all of that said and done, our machine has now been upgraded, so we'll give everything a bit of a wipe to get rid of some of the smudges, and we're good to go. So here you have it. The most powerful 21.5-inch 4K iMac that there will ever be. It is physically impossible to get a more powerful one, at least in terms of the CPU. Yeah, you could get the Vega 20 and then put a Core i9 in that, and that would be truly the most powerful machine, but this is as far as it goes. You cannot put a better CPU than what this machine has. It's so good that Apple didn't even give it to us. I had to do it myself, and it was kind of annoying. I guarantee there were a number of you who didn't think this was actually gonna work. Leave a comment down below if at the start of this video you were like, no way, there's no way that's gonna boot up. But here it is, how about that? Okay, so let's talk about the process of actually upgrading this thing, because I'll tell you one thing, it's a lot easier to just buy an iMac from Apple than to do what I did today, especially with that kind of scary power supply situation. Yeah, working on these is not necessarily the most difficult thing, but it's not for everyone. And if you're squeamish about upgrading the RAM in your computer, then you probably shouldn't attempt something like this. But if you're watching this video, then chances are you're trying to maximize your dollar. And potentially this could be the best way to do that. I think we should go through a couple of benchmark numbers to see how this supercharged iMac compares to a stock M1 machine. So starting off with Geekbench 5, weirdly the i9 iMac scores lower than the M1. It scores 7400 compared to 7700 on average for the full-fat M1 chip. That's a little bit weird. And then if we move over to Geekbench Compute, it doesn't get a whole lot better because the Radeon Pro 555X is frankly garbage, and it scores 15,789 compared to 19,958 from the base model M1 iMac. This thing is certainly not a graphics powerhouse. Now, that Radeon Pro 555X might sound familiar. It's the exact same GPU that you would find in the 2018 and 2019 base model 15-inch MacBook Pros, and boy can you tell that it's a couple of years old. The Radeon Pro 500 series, which is basically the 400 series, is from like 2016, 2015, so yeah, it's not a good graphics platform, and the M1 absolutely is going to smoke this thing when it comes to anything graphics bound. But if we go back and look at some CPU stuff, this thing really starts cooking, and I'm not just talking about the temperatures. Cinebench R23 reveals a pretty significant gain for the Core i9, 9214 compared to 3600 with the Core i3, which puts this not only ahead of its previous version, but ahead of every M1 device that you could buy, no matter how much you spend on it. This blatant increase in horsepower is evident also in Blender. In the BMW render, it takes 3 minutes and 30 seconds, nearly half the time that the M1 is able to accomplish the task, and the classroom render is under 10 minutes when the M1 base model iMac is nearly 20. Now granted, in Blender there is an added benefit to this being an Intel machine, meaning it doesn't have to run Rosetta, but the performance gains are nothing to scoff at, and this is a seriously powerful machine now. However, I think it's worth noting that it kind of makes sense that this is more powerful. This is a 65-watt desktop processor, and we're pitting it against basically an iPad. The M1 chip is in everything from an $800 iPad to $2,000 plus if you really spec out the iMac, but the point is, it's not a desktop class chip. So yes, it does very well considering that it draws like under 40 watts of power in the Mac Mini, but this is it's just gonna beat it. Now, I know what you're thinking. There is a side effect to running a 65 watt 8-core i9 in this chassis, and that is the thermals, because quite frankly, this was not designed for that. Basically, the way that macOS handles this computer is it just kind of keeps the CPU around its base clock speeds, and it just kind of keeps it at a 65 to 70 watt power draw. Pretty simple. So when you start running a Cinebench test, you can very quickly see that it tries to draw up to 120 watts of power and it starts boosting up the CPU, and then macOS is like, nah, let's maybe dial it back a little bit here, fella. And then it sort of settles in at around 65 to 70 watts, and it also stays around its base clock. Now, it doesn't ever drop below that. It's a 3.1 gigahertz base processor, and it usually sits around 3.4 to 3.6, and honestly, the results are pretty good. You're not going to get the exact same performance that you would get if you put this in a PC, obviously, but given that this iMac has a 180 watt power supply for the whole system, I think it handles it pretty well. So what we have here is a pretty interesting situation. In terms of the CPU, it is objectively more powerful than any M1 machine, and not necessarily by a small amount, especially if your workflow hasn't been optimized for Apple Silicon yet. However, the graphics are definitely worse than the new iMac. The screen is smaller, the design is a lot more dated, and it is a bit of a hassle to actually get this thing upgraded. So I guess it comes back to the question at the beginning of the video. Is this worth it? Well, to be honest, given that this costs about the same as a base model M1 iMac if you wanted to do this yourself, I don't really think it's worth the effort to do this instead. However, if you do have one of these iMacs and you're like, oh man, I wish I had a little bit more oomph, but I don't want to go for the M1 because it's not quite enough. If you have the energy, for $350, you can put the Core i9 in. You can put the 32 gigs of RAM for $150, which is way less than you would even pay for 16 gigabytes from Apple. And you can actually upgrade the storage as well. You could put a 2 terabyte OWC SSD in here. I've got that linked below, one that would work with this machine, by the way. You could also put in a normal mechanical hard drive if you got that special SATA cable that Apple uses. This has room to be expanded, which the M1 doesn't. So if you have an iMac like this, or even a 27-inch as well, because those all have upgradable CPUs, and you think, the M1 iMac isn't quite what I need yet, I think honestly, if you can handle it, if you can, literally handle that power supply and take the annoyance of doing this upgrade, it's a pretty cost-effective way to supercharge your iMac. So I'm very curious to hear what you guys think about this project. As far as I'm aware, not a lot of people have done this before. I was able to find one forum post where someone had put this Core i9 in this iMac, but there's a lot of confusion about whether this would be possible, and it seems like I'm only one of a handful of people that have attempted something like this. But if you're watching this, yes, absolutely, you can put a Core i9 in a 4K iMac, and it makes a big difference. But I'm curious to know, is it a big enough difference? Let me know that in the comments below, and as usual, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.